Is one of our remote talkers, remote speakers, a gentleman called Jeff Houston. Um, if you've been in the industry long enough, you've probably heard him speak somewhere or watched a YouTube video that he's presented on. We saw this talk in Bangkok about 2 weeks ago and thought it would be a nice fit for this session. And just speaking about sort of where the IPv4 where the IPv4 world is going at the moment in terms of what we see in the BGP world. We should be able to have him on afterwards for some questions. We were just having an issue with the Zoom a bit earlier, so if we don't have a gap for questions, apologies, but yeah, we'll get the video rolling now. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, whatever it may be. Hi, my name is Jeff Houston. I am the Chief Scientist at APNIC, and I'm sorry I'm unable to actually make it over to South Africa for ZANOG today. Planes, budgets, ticket costs, blah, blah, blah. So it's virtual me doing this recording for you. I will try, though, to try and be online when this is replayed so that I will be around if you have any questions. So what are we talking about today? You know, when you try and look at the internet, you got a problem. Because last I heard, the internet is really, really, really big. And it's very, very hard to coalesce all of those separate parts of the internet and get a grand view. Sure, you can measure the internet in your neck of the network. You could look at it from the perspective of your home, your workplace, your ISP, but that's just one perspective out of literally tens of thousands. How do you get a picture of everything? How do you get the entire internet? Well, interestingly enough, there's one tool that actually brings every last piece of the internet to you. And that, oddly enough, is the job of the routing protocol, BGP. Because if you run BGP, then everyone who is advertising routes all over the net, the job of BGP is to bring all of that to you. And by looking at BGP, oddly enough, you get a picture of all of the internet all of the time. And this actually gives us, I think, some real insights into what is happening on the internet today, and even some indications as to why it might be happening this way. So let's dive in and have a look at BGP, and in particular, let's look at the last 12 months, BGP in 2023. So the highlights, look, I'll go through V4, V6, some projections on the routing space, the fib, churn and conclusions. So this is 30 years of the internet, all pulled together in one magnificent slide. It actually combines not only my view of BGP in my neck of the woods, one view, but I combine it with another, these days, close to 650 views from both Route Views, University of Oregon, and from RIPE's Routing Information Service, and I pull up all of their views and all of their peers all of the time. And so this is a snapshot every 8 hours for 30 years. So there's a lot of data here. But you can actually see some of the major highlights of the internet since 30 years ago. There was this period down there in 1994, way down in the bottom left of the slide there, where we were growing so quickly, 20,000 routes, that the poor old IBM PCXTs were just unable to cope, and we're having to shed bits of the internet to make it all squeeze in together. And we thought we were going to die the death of the routing explosion. It was just going to be too big for computers to handle. And so, in amongst other things, which led to V6, we also introduced a move away from the address plan of the internet up until then. Because up until around 1993, addresses only came in one of three sizes. A bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, really, if you're familiar with that one. You had a Class A, which, was just too big. There were very, very few networks out there that really matched the, 16.7 million host addresses that came in a Class A. Um, and then there were Class Cs, to the other end of the address size, which had 256 host addresses. And although this was kind of okay for small networks for a while, as personal computers started to multiply, as they did, 256 in most sort of enterprise or university environments was just too little. And there was this strange kind of Class B in the middle, um, which was 64,000 addresses, 65,356 or something. Who cares? 2 to the 16th, which was sort of better than a C and not so extravagant as an A. And so it became very popular. But at the same time, we were going to run out of all those Bs very, very quickly in 1992 with, oh my God, disaster. What do you do? Well, we did, oddly enough, the sensible thing. We got rid of classes. So instead of just those 3 address sizes, we said, well, why don't we just carry the size with the route object? So you could have a /24, a /23, a /22, whatever size you need that we can sort of squeeze into the address space. And this model of routing, and indeed of addressing, classless interdomain routing, kind of saved us. And the life we've been living since then has been all classless. So that was cider in 1994. And you can see by the small blip, the growth of the internet stopped for, at least 6 months. But it was back to its steady growth again. Some of you might remember the great internet boom and the subsequent bust around the year 2000, 2001, where, the internet had taken the world by storm. Not really. And although the bust lasted for all of about, 6 months, as you can see there, we were back on again. Because across the noughties, the ISP business changed hands and it moved from being small entrepreneurs with bunches of dial-ups into the telephone companies actually making a move and swinging the internet into their infrastructure. And all of a sudden, instead of an enthusiast market playing games, this was becoming mass market. Firstly, it was mass market using modems, which was always a pain. Remember them? Horrible. Any of you using them, stop it. We then moved to a permanent connection model using DSL, actually using that analog connection but ganging it up vertically. So instead of having a few kilobits per second, DSL could scale up from low megabits into sort of 10, 20, 30, if you were lucky, I guess, megabits per second with sort of high-speed DSL solutions. And across the noughties, we were deploying like crazy. By 2011, the central pool operated by the IANA ran dry. And we were in the midst of fueling this massive wave of internet. And oddly enough, you hardly even noticed that on the graph. The internet just kept on growing. And even as the registries themselves started to run out of addresses, the routing space just grew and grew and grew, which seems like a contradiction until you realize that what we were doing was slicing and dicing at ever finer levels. So that before you might get a /16, you might have cut that up into a few /18s, which themselves were sliced and diced into 23s and 24s. And it wasn't really until the last couple of years, I think, that you actually see in this graph that pace of growth has finally slackened off some 13 or so years after the first point of exhaustion, those central pools. So let's look at 2023 in particular, and this is the size of the routing table in V4 across those 12 months from every peer of recent route views. So each color thread is one peer. And the first thing you notice, which is kind of weird, is that almost nobody sees the same internet as anybody else. We don't really pay a huge amount of attention to actually all making sure we have the same view of the internet. And in addressing terms, the variations as big as around 18 million addresses between, the peer with the smallest view of default to the one with the most extravagant. Notice that big discontinuity there around in fact, late April, early March, where everyone sort of dropped some routes, except the low order. Everybody. What was it? It was Turkey, where two ASs, 9121 and 47331, collectively dropped around 7,500 prefixes. All of a sudden, really all of a sudden, just in March 2023. And oddly enough, it wasn't that Turkey was pulling out, TT was pulling out of the internet, not at all. But they withdrew more specifics. They were taking out of the network their traffic engineering prefixes and simply working off their aggregates. We'll return to that, I think, because it's kind of an interesting fact that normally BGP carries two roles, connectivity and traffic engineering. And if all of your content is a long, long way away, engineering that traffic to come across all of your available links, so you selectively advertise more specifics down down some of your links, is something we've been doing for years. But Turkey has stopped. TTNet has stopped doing that. And you kind of go, why? And of course, the obvious answer is because all of their traffic is now coming from data centers inside Turkey. And so now there's no real need to perform that fine-grained traffic engineering because all the traffic is now localized, not being imported from America, from Europe, from faraway places. So when we look at dropped prefixes, Turkey wasn't the only ones. There have been a number of networks, and the ones that I think I find interesting is the drop in SprintLink, CenturyLink, both of which are relatively large US providers, and China, and the ones that are growing, Amazon, yes, but the rest aren't really core. The big US networks are not actually growing in the amount of routes that they're advertising on the internet. So in some ways, it's an odd picture that there is some growth, but realistically, there's also some drops. So there's prefixes and there's addresses. And interestingly, if we look at the internet, the V4 internet, from the point of view of address span, how many addresses are actually covered in these advertisements, you get a completely different picture. Because now the great internet boom was a nothing. The consumer model across the noughties certainly was consuming a lot of addresses. We started a little over 1 billion addresses in 2000 or so, and we got to 2.5 billion addresses being advertised by 2012. But by the time we got to 2.5 billion addresses, and don't forget, there are really only 3 billion addresses in play, all of the last, 10 years, in fact, 12 years, has been in eking out those remaining addresses, those 500 million addresses or so. And although there's this sort of blip, which was the old /8s given to the Department of Defense, in the year dot, when Methuselah was a young man, the rest of it's actually a different picture. We have been cramming ourselves as the number of devices obviously grew from millions to billions. We did it with almost no additional addresses being advertised into the routing system. And now when we look at 2023 in detail, this is a shocking picture. This is the first time you see a picture of the internet where it's not up and to the right, it's down to the right. This is a picture, oddly enough, of contraction and decline. And, with the exception of some sterling work by Amazon, who still insists on giving unique addresses to some of its clients, which advertised, a bucket of addresses in August last year, it's just slow and steady decline. Never thought I'd live to see this. And you start to think about what's happening in the internet. I'm like, have we got to the point of the S word, saturation? Has everyone who's ever wanted a connection got one? Is there growth left? Hard to say, but there's more data around that actually suggests that yes, the internet is declining. This is taking a graph of the amount of addresses being allocated out of the regional address registries. And on the whole, across the year, nothing happened. There's not that much to give out. The unadvertised pool of addresses didn't shrink. It grew by about a /8. It's 18 million addresses. And the advertised pool That's the, by the way, the Amazon blip. The advertised pool declined by that same amount. The internet in V4 sense from addressing is actually getting smaller. We thought with address trading, moving addresses around, that this would actually flush out unadvertised addresses. They'd be able to make money by selling their unused addresses on the open market, and this would encourage more efficient use. But we've been wrong. In the longer term, and this is that same graph, but now with a midpoint, a start point back in 2018, you see that the unadvertised pool has been inexorably growing. And the only thing that changed that step function was the US Department of Defense bringing some unadvertised addresses up and advertising them. If it wasn't for that, what we are seeing is, in fact, the advertised pool continues to shrink. SprintLink, wow, 6 million addresses disappeared. Lucent, another big provider, 2 million. AT&T Internet, one of the big three, down by 2 million. Even Google, which didn't have that many addresses advertised to start with, 10.2 million. But by the end of the year, it's down to 9 million. Even Comcast, the biggest retail provider in the US, down by 1.1 million. So oddly enough, the address span is coming down, not from the edges, but right from the core where the largest networks are. The US, those old unused /8s, yes, they all appeared on the network, thank you. And there's Amazon's contribution of 2 million addresses, thank you, Amazon. But there's not really a picture of massive growth. Not really. It's actually one of reduced. The growth of the entire size of the network is slowing down, and from the addressing perspective, it's declining like crazy. Only 1,100 new autonomous systems over the year. Previous year it was 1,400. So in some ways, everything is slowing down or even reversing. And it's a reasonable question to ask, have we reached peak V4? Is this as big as we need to get? Does everyone who need an internet connection have one? Are NATs so much part of the fabric that the growth in devices, and there is some growth in raw device count, is this all just being absorbed by NATs? Is V4, if you will, had its day? Are we now declining? And if so, and that's a fine thing to look at, the numbers are suggesting that, is it all about V6? Now, you look at the 20-year view of V6, and the data doesn't go back beyond 2004. The first look is, oh my God, that's where the growth is. It looks strongly exponential. You see that huge curve between 20 and 22 that, in the early years of COVID, things started to go a little bit crazy out there. And V6 was just hammering. It's slowed down a bit since then. And certainly by January 2024, though, what I do find sort of interesting is that same vertical diversity that we see in V4, not everyone has the same view, is now appearing in V6 as well. And so in 2023 across the year, there is some growth. This is 160,000 entries at the start of the year, and closing the year somewhere between 180 and around 190, 200,000 entries in the V6 routing table. Why there's such a big difference between various BGP speakers out there, not sure. The upper band, I think, is Europe. The lower band is America. Still not sure why. Some step functions. Vietnam decided to, in one of their major service providers, advertise 3,000 new prefixes, and over in Hong Kong, another 2,000, for which we're very grateful. Thank you. But there is one thing, you noticed in V4, the more specifics were coming down. I said that was a declining role of traffic engineering because content is shifting closer to the edge. You don't need traffic engineering. And that's a fine theory. But if you look at V6, the more specifics, which were originally back in 10 years ago, 30% of the routing table, is now hitting a phenomenal 60%, of which, these days, most of those more specifics are /48s. This is insane because there are so many /48s, 2 to the 48th of them, that if everyone did that, your routers would not handle it. They would melt. Why does everyone think that a /48 is the IPv6 equivalent of a /24? I don't know. But nevertheless, everyone advertises a whole hunk of them. 2/3 of the network is wasted in /48s. This is the contrasting view of addresses. So let's just go back a second. Massive growth. Because in addressing terms, what's being actually advertised is not huge growth. Now, it's always hard to find the right unit for V6. And so this isn't /128s, and it's not even /32s, or at least it is, but think of thousands of /32s, you know. So we're rising from, 20,000 /32s being advertised, 20 years ago, up to around 160,000 /32s today. Again, quite some variation. Not everyone has the same reachability as everyone else, and nobody seems to care. As long as you've got your fix from YouTube, Netflix, and all the rest of the video streamers, who cares about talking to anyone else? And so ubiquitous connectivity is no longer an issue for this industry. No one minds, no one cares, no one fixes it. In 2003, the V6 network grew a little, a very small amount. So if you said, well, all the growth in V4 was moved into growth in V6, you'd probably be wrong. It grew by around 17%. It's predominantly /48s. The growth of /32s was very small. The address span just 1.6%. So it's not really growing. So let's now take all those numbers and make some projections from them. And this is again unique. This is the first time that the numbers say we've peaked in V4. Now, I don't know if that's, real, but this is the best fit of those numbers from the last 5 years. Gives you an order 2 polynomial where, in effect, we've reached the top. That it's just a little under a core arrangement of around 1 million odd networks. That's about it. The numbers suggest after that it starts to decline. Whether it's going to happen or not, different thing. But that's what the numbers are saying. V6 used to be exponential. It's now strongly linear. It's a long and steady growth. And, over the coming sort of 5 years, it might well hit 400,000 entries in the routing table, but it's pushing it, That linear growth model is very, very constrained. So it's growth, but not a lot. The underlying network, is more about /48s than anything else. So in absolute terms, because V6 is 4 times bigger than V4 in your routing tables, it's growing faster than V4, but the major issue is BGP will keep on going for some time. It's not under any major stress. The other thing, of course, is it's not the size, but it's the dynamic properties that really, really, really matter. And this is an odd graph. It has the size of the routing table, but now the number of updates I see in my network on the edge. And the first thing you notice is, although the size is growing, the dynamic activity is not. And in fact, the number of updates over the last 12 months or so has actually come down. The bottom line is the number of withdrawals. And again, bizarrely, apart from some oddity in 2023, whoever they were doing, whoever it was, they stopped it, thank you, is tiny. That most of the network is phenomenally stable. And indeed, that number of updates has been coming down, as I noted. The number of prefixes that BGP qualifies each day is also constrained. There might be close to 1 million prefixes in the routing table, but around 80,000 or so per day are subject to updates. And that's been slowly growing, far more slowly growing than the size of the routing table. Distance vector routing protocols shouldn't behave like that, but oddly enough, in BGP on the internet, they do. The slow increase is certainly unusual and unexpected. And what's even more unexpected is the performance of BGP has remained constant, indeed even improved in recent years. If you look at a series of updates that are trying to find the new stable path, and you look at how long it takes for each update event to stabilize, back in 2014 or so, it was around 50 seconds, 2 3/4 MRI timers. These days, it's actually slightly lower at around 45 to getting even closer to 40 seconds. The network is actually performing better, even though it's much, much larger. That again is amazing and certainly unpredicted. So it's stable. Routing instability is now concentrated in a small number of pathologically bad cases, and the rest of the network is just stable. But that's V4. No one looks at V6. No one cares about V6. And it's probably evidenced by the fact that V6 is far less stable, far more unstable. If you look at the size of the routing table, this is a log scale, so be careful. As we grow up to around 200,000 routes in the routing table, the number of, if you will, instability events, the number of updates, is also kicking around close to that number and has been rising as the routing table rises. And the number of withdrawals has also been growing. So this is not a network that is well contained. It actually has different properties. The growth trajectory has slackened off, and the updates and withdrawals have slackened off largely because of that in the last 12 months, but it's still a different profile. The number of unstable prefixes is not constant, it's growing with the size of the routing table. So it's a different network. And for a long time, it was phenomenally unstable because of all these overlays of tunneling V6 over other things. That's really, really hard to keep, if you will, the network stable. And what we're finding now, of course, only recently is that stability appearing with a convergence time that's also around 50 odd seconds or so. So things are getting better, which is just as well. Instability, though, is interesting. If everyone was equally contributing updates, the profile would be along the green line. Every AS would contribute a fixed proportion of updates. What we actually find is, for example, in IPv6, just 2 ASs contributed half of the update load in the last 2 weeks of 2023. So what's actually going on is this instability. It's concentrated in a small number of almost pathologically unstable cases. In terms of futures, there was a period around 98 to 2000 when we thought we're all going to die a heat death of BGP. BGP was growing faster than Moore's law. Costs were rising. Oh my God, it was all disaster. Didn't happen. In general, BGP has been phenomenally well behaved. The drivers for growth are now basically disappearing. And because we're pushing content closer and closer to the edge of the network, and content distribution networks are key to the future of the internet over the coming years, that pushing to the edge has removed all the pressure on the middle. Much of the pressure on BGP is now slackened. We don't even need to use BGP for traffic engineering if all of your traffic is coming from down the road at a data center near you. And so because of that, much of the stress in the routing system has disappeared, and even the growth drivers have disappeared with it. However, there are still folk who get caught out. In Australia in October last year, one of the major providers, Optus, managed to field routers where as soon as you exceeded 1 million entries, it said max prefix limit, bring the session down, which was kind of a disaster because the session was the session to their offshore network control center. And so the control center no longer controlled the network, it was cut off because, 1 million entries, session shutdown. Optus. So there are probably others being caught in the same trap. Because that's one of the defaults out there in equipment, that when you get to around 1 million, session shutdown appears to be the default behavior. You maybe should look at that, and if you do exceed max prefixes, you should set your router to freeze the routing table and keep on forwarding packets. Bringing down the session that caused that overload is perhaps the worst possible response. So know your limits in your network. Know how much memory you've got and how much fib capacity. And make sure that you're within safe limits of that. So yes, you're going to need a lot of memory, and it's the most expensive memory you can buy because on those line cards, this is fast memory. So now you're going to need about the same memory footprint for V6 as for V4. So look at that, review them, make sure you know them. And you don't need to carry all the routes all the time. Default is your friend, use it. And some vendors are now bringing out hot caching in their line cards because, quite frankly, no one uses all million entries. Once you've gone to Google, Netflix, YouTube, and a few others, that's it. Users don't go anywhere else. And if you had hot caching in your line cards, and said, well, you've gone off to Poland or somewhere far away, that might take a bit longer. No one will really notice. And it will be a whole lot easier to keep your router operating within reasonable performance rates with hot caching in your line cards. So those kind of suggestions might help you in terms of looking at the next few years. So I've run through my time. Hopefully I'm within the time limit. Thank you very much for your attention. And with luck, I'm online, able to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Okay, so the luck was not there. We were unable to get him hailed in Zoom from Australia. We couldn't get hold of him via phone either, so either we got the time zones wrong or some other problem. So just the interesting bit from that I took out of this when I was in Apricot, because there's another talk from some IP brokers also showing that their IPv4 pricing almost follows that graph of people starting to pull back prefixes from the routing table. So I really do hope that means more and more people are using IPv4 and there's not some other calamity coming. But yeah. Anyhow, up next we've got Jan Vermeulen from the editor from My Broadband, the largest tech news website in South Africa, probably the continent as well. So yeah, over to you.
All right, let's get this party started. So if I make jokes, I think this is something that's actually quite common across cultures on this beautiful continent of ours. So, like, Africans deal with incredible adversity with humor. We see that in South Africa a lot. If my jokes do not resonate with everybody watching, understand it's just my dark journalist humor combined with our typical South Africanness of how we handle things like load shedding and state capture. We laugh in the face of adversity lest we cry. But please don't take joking and lightheartedness for making light of how serious this is. The title is attention grabbing. It is not hyperbole in the slightest. Afrinic is in deep flippin' trouble. Before we get going, some disclaimers. There are people in this room. Is this good? Do I need to stand closer to this thing? Because is this good over here, as long as there's no feedback? There are people in this room that know an awful lot more than I do about specific topics, and hopefully they can add their expertise. But there are also lawyers involved. There's an incredible amount of litigation, and so not everybody can speak their minds. And that's where I have the best job, because I can say things that other people can't necessarily. This is only current as of yesterday. This is an incredibly fast-moving situation, and so what I say here right now could very well change in the next 12 hours. We'll see. And then obligatory, these opinions expressed, blah, 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 batteries not included. And before we kick off completely, so for the folks who are watching online, and especially in Mauritius right now at Afrinic, thank you very, very much for staying the course, for continuing to slog it out in an incredibly demoralizing environment, for continuing to make sure that things tick over and work. Those of us who know what's going on really appreciate you. Please keep doing that. With that out the way, let's see if we can fix this thing. This is one of my favorite lines from The Big Short. Truth is like poetry, and most people fucking hate poetry. That's one of the great things that I get to do with in my job, is I get to seek the truth, I get to look at the truth, and I get to proclaim the truth whenever possible. As to the best of my ability, because the thing is, there's a massive information asymmetry here. And so, in that sense, this is the truth based on the facts at hand. So, because this is being broadcast, and ZANOG and ISPA are recording this, and they probably want to put this on their YouTube channel, I want to propose something. So, whatever I say, fair game. Attributed to me, it's me saying it in my personal capacity as the reporter who has been looking into this for many years. That's fine. But when we have the discussion at the end, I would like to propose the Chatham House rule. So the Chatham House rule is, when a meeting or part thereof is held under the Chatham House rule, participants are free to use the information received, but neither the identity nor the affiliation of the speakers nor that of any other participant may be revealed. Are there any journalists, bloggers, podcasters, YouTubers, Twitch streamers, TikTokers in this room that want to be able to attribute what is discussed afterwards? Or can we hold to the Chatham House rule? So that includes people who are going to be able to participate from the live stream. You don't get a say. The people in the room get a say, unfortunately, and you have to abide by what the people in the room decide. Are there any objections to applying the Chatham House rule to the discussion afterwards? Okay, unanimous agreement. I'll also just remind everybody afterwards. So how broken is Afrinic? Very broken. And I'll try to do a quick recap. Show of hands, has anybody seen John Curran's update on the current status from ZANOG 2 weeks ago? Okay, so that means I get to do what he's done, which is provide a quick update, but I get to do it in much less flowery language. Love John Curran. He is a case study in how to speak the truth and how to give an update when you're under constant threat of being sued. If you want an object lesson on how to handle a difficult situation like that, he's very careful with his language, very careful with his wording. You have to infer a lot and connect a lot of dots. I have the benefit of not having to do that. So let's call a spade a shovel. So where this starts for me is around 2019, a Californian internet investigator named Ron Gilmet contacts me and says, hey, listen, I think I've uncovered something pretty freaking shady at Afrinic. And I'm not going to take you through the whole blow by blow. Bottom line is, we ultimately catch Afrinic's #2 employee, Ernest Bayuranga, stealing IPv4 addresses from the free pool and leasing them as an IP broker. Then there's a whole separate part of this that involves other individuals where they hijacked a bunch of legacy IP address blocks belonging to South African institutions. That includes government agencies, companies, what eventually became SITA, and using those, leasing those out, essentially. And so, for those who don't know, legacy IP address space is IP address space that you don't have to pay Afrinic a membership fee for. It's incredibly valuable in that sense. That's where this starts. So, rather than focus on dealing with that and reclaiming the stolen address blocks, I think the address blocks stolen by Ernest was relatively easy because we had compiled like a whole dossier on what had happened, and Afrinic was able to augment that data with their own internal data. No problem, reclaim that address space. It was put in like a hold, everything suggests Ernest was not alone, right? So you have to find out what else had been stolen and reclaim that. And then the legacy address space stuff is incredibly hairy to deal with because there's people in that space using it right now who don't know that they've bought stolen space. And you have to reclaim it from people who are not, Ernest was like, you've caught me, police charges were laid against him, he was fired, and the address space was reclaimed. The legacy IP address space involves people not on the African, one guy who's not on the African continent and one foreign national who, as far as we know, is actually resident in South Africa. But untangling that is much harder because those guys might sue you, and one of them, in fact, has instituted legal action against Afrinic, which he ultimately lost. But that alone would have been a task on its own. And rather than focus on that, what Afrinic did is they went after a resource member called Cloud Innovation. So they decide that they're going to bite off another big chunk that they obviously couldn't chew, and Cloud Innovation rallies its allies and associates, and it ultimately brings Afrinic to its knees. Now, lest it be said that I'm casting Cloud Innovation as the bad guy, put yourself in Cloud Innovation's shoes. Before I tell you anything else about Cloud Innovation, you own IP addresses, the ISPs in the room, everybody else in the room who's a resource member at Afrinic, and they threaten to take your resources away for whatever reason, all of it, by the way, not just reclaim what you're not using, they take it all back. What would you do? Right, so with that in mind, let's explore a little bit what's happened here. And hopefully you'll come to realize, as I have, that there are very few bad guys in this story. Like, there's just people. There's people doing bad things, there's people doing good things. But it's just people looking out for their own self-interest. Why go after Cloud Innovation? I think that table, for anybody who knows IPs, explains a lot. Cloud Innovation is sitting on a ton of space, 2/12s, 2/11s, and I worked out the street value based on $50 per IP. That's 314 million US. For those who want to work in Rand, multiply by, where are we today? 18.8, multiply by 19. You're talking billions of rands of asset, right? That's also incentive for why Cloud Innovation fought tooth and nail to protect it. It's a huge thing that it's sitting on. And what Jeff was speaking about earlier today was actually quite encouraging. As we start talking about what's happening in IPv4 and IPv6, the natural progression of what's happening there might actually feed into a solution of what happens here at the end of the day. Okay, so Cloud Innovation sits on a ton of resources. Now, it's more than a rumor how Cloud Innovation got these resources. The founder of Cloud Innovation and Laris, his name is Lu Heng. He and I have spoken at length multiple times. I've actually put the question to him because it's basically an open secret in the industry that Cloud Innovation applied for these addresses and the reasons it gave, because when you apply for IPs from Afrinic, you have to give reasons. The reasons he gave was he's essentially going to use these to provide VPN services to people in mainland China so that they can punch through the Great Firewall. For those of us in Africa, that's a very noble cause. On China mainland, not so much. But that means that whoever approved these resources knew that these resources were not going to be used in Africa. They were going to be used overseas for a good cause. Now, what happens, there's a huge amount of consternation over this huge chunk of address space that just gets assigned to a guy who's launched a company technically in the Afrinic region. It's in the Seychelles. And who, by all accounts, like he's quite open about it. He's not African. He's a Chinese national. And so this causes huge friction in the community. And we'll talk a little bit about like those geographic and cultural frictions that exist in the community, because I think it's important to understand those while we discuss solutions. Okay, so what happens is Cloud Innovation, I'm going to now try to speed run this because we have to get to the discussion at the end. That's the meat and potatoes. So Cloud Innovation gets its first /12 in 2013, the rest of its resources in 2014. Within a few years, though, Cloud Innovation is leasing these addresses. And it's unclear where the VPN service went. But it's not doing it directly. So there's a new company launched called Laris Cloud Services Limited, sometime in 2016 or 2017. And there's an arm's length relationship between Cloud Innovation and Laris. They refer to one another as partners. But Liu Heng founded both. It's the same thing when you cut through it all. So what I do know in terms of the timeline, 2016 versus 2017, is the Laris org record, org LCSL1 Afrinic, was created on 19 January 2017. So if you want a timeline, it's roughly then. Then in 2020, Afrinic sends out essentially what's a cease and desist, or a warning to go, we are going to take back your resources unless you can explain to us how you're using it. Very abridged. But essentially, Afrinic alleged three things. Cloud Innovation's whois records do not match how the IPs are used. Cloud Innovation is no longer using its IP address blocks for the reasons it gave when it applied for them. And most of the address space was being used outside the Afrinic region. Now, Cloud Innovation, for its part, disputed keeping disputed the whois record allegation. It says it keeps its whois records more up to date than most. I could not find much fault with that statement. If I compare how Laris and Cloud Innovation handles its whois affairs versus the average South African ISP. It also disputed the fact that it was no longer using its address space for the reasons it gave when it applied for them, like disputed it outright. And then also said that there was, by the way, there's no mechanism to tell Afrinic that I'm using it for a different purpose now. Right, and then the third one, it said that there was no Afrinic policy blocking the address space from being used outside the Afrinic region. And that's true until now, until we reach soft landing. So Afrinic is now in its last /8. There's a new policy for that specifically, which says that there's like a whole complicated thing about like you can use it out there, but it has to like link back to Africa, blah, 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 blah. But until the last /8, you could use your resources however you liked. And so there's really only one leg that I can see for Afrinic to stand on. And that's in the Resource Services Agreement that everybody has to sign, the RSA. There is a line in there that says that you have to use the resources for the reasons stipulated. Now, as I said, I've had very long conversations with Liu Heng in the past, and he has refused to confirm or deny whether indeed he got these addresses with the motivation that they would be used for VPN services. There's no documentary evidence about what he applied for these addresses for, but there are witnesses in this room who will sign affidavits attesting to the fact that Liu Heng indeed applied for these resources to launch VPN services. For whatever that's worth, it might be a moot point in the courts at the end of the day. So what I'm trying to say is that Afrinic potentially had a leg to stand on, but there's also plenty of resource members in this room who will go, yeah, but if they go for Cloud Innovation, even though that is a lot of space, they could come for me next, even though I've got a much smaller amount of space. If you apply the law of universality and you say what's good for the goose is good for the gander, that's a potential problem because Afrinic could come for your resources next. And so that creates a kind of a band of people with vested interests, even though they might be diametrically opposed in ideology. So Cloud Innovation responds to Afrinic's threat with a disparaging letter, essentially accusing them of not knowing what the hell they're doing, and followed it up with an application for an injunction in the Mauritian courts on 13 July 2020. Now I want to illustrate something a little bit about how the Mauritian courts work. After hearing the case, the court only set the application aside almost a year later, 7 July. It took a year to hear an injunction in the Mauritian courts. Okay, and we'll get to some more stuff later on. And then as luck would have it, luck, maybe more than luck, but let's not assume anything. As luck would have it, the Afrinic board was sitting that very week. over the 7th and the 8th of July for a board meeting. And it adjourned, just for like a little bit of detail. They started the meeting at 9 on the 7th of July. It ran until after 1, and then there were complaints that this meeting was running far too long. So they adjourned until the next day. It was on the 7th that the court hands down the judgment in the interdict application. It dismisses the interdict. So Cloud Innovation loses. The very next day, the Afrinic board resolves, we are taking away Cloud Innovation's resources. They issue a public statement to that effect, and faced with the prospect of seeing his multi-million-dollar business go up in smoke, Lu Heng, Cloud Innovation, launches an all-out assault on Afrinic. What does an all-out assault on Afrinic look like? Jan, once again, are you speaking in hyperbole here? Afrinic has a list of court cases on its website. I apologize if I give anybody motion sickness. If you get any motion sickness, wave your hands. A microphone, sorry. Yes, people are trying to listen in. So this thing will loop forever, so that you guys can see what I'm talking about when I'm talking about lawfare. Where does it stop? 59. And there's more. There are cases that are not listed on this. And if you go through that, so the first thing that happens in the opening salvo between Cloud Innovation and Afrinic, Cloud Innovation is able to get a court order in Mauritius that locks Afrinic out of its bank account. It locked Afrinic out of its bank account for 2.5 months. It did this with a damages claim. So first it files a damages claim. It says Afrinic owes me 50 million in damages for what it's about to do, or for what it's doing to me. Right? Then it files a garnish for an application for a garnish order. The garnish order does not hear the merits of the case. It is granted under what they term at own risk and perils, which means that the enforcing party, in this case Cloud Innovation, can serve the garnish order on Afrinic's bank, and if there's if it's found that it's done so improperly or whatever the case might be, then Afrinic, maybe the bank, can sue Cloud Innovation in return, because it's essentially the court is saying, we're not saying you can do this, but we've got a mechanism for you to attach the assets to make sure Afrinic doesn't rabbit with it, which was incredibly low risk, but be that as it may, that's why this mechanism exists. But like, if there's anything wrong with what you've told us, if there's anything wrong with the way this application was handled, if there's anything wrong with how you implemented this garnish order, you're on the hook for it. But Cloud Innovation is a company registered in the Seychelles. Like, its liability in Mauritius is incredibly limited. And so there is no risk and perils. It can essentially do this at will, because the chance of facing consequences for doing so improperly is incredibly low. But this comes back to later when we need to discuss what approach, if we're going to fix this, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? All right, so Afrinic's drowned in legislation, and this lawfare is like a thing of technicalities. How does Afrinic get its bank account back? It launches a counter application to say that the power of attorney that Cloud Innovation signed for its lawyer in Mauritius was wrong. The court says, yeah, that's right, and it voids the garnish order. 2.5 months later, but at least that's shorter than a year. Right? And like this whole thing, it's like a battle of these technicalities between the parties. So if you scroll through this, you'll see that there's like a lot of things that look positive. It says application withdrew, we won, application set aside. It looks like Afrinic is winning. Afrinic is not winning, not in the slightest, because where it matters, it's lost. So where Afrinic stands today, it is headless, it is rudderless. There's no one in the organization who's empowered to make strategic decisions. So the staff who are working there, that's why I thank them for what they're doing, because they're doing so under incredibly difficult circumstances. Essentially what happened was, as this grew to a crescendo, is Afrinic was about to hold elections, because how Afrinic works is it's a members-based, supposed to be a members-driven organization. So The directorship is, unlike corporates that you might be familiar with, they are elected. Sort of like a board of trustees at a sectional title here in South Africa. So the trustees are separated by geographic region. There are some who exist without region, and then the membership vote on who they want to see as their candidate. And they were about to have this vote, and this got so ugly. And I think it's important to understand the quagmire that is Afrinic elections if we're going to talk about long-term solutions for this, right? So this most recent election, there were incredibly serious, let's just use the word serious, allegations about what Lu Heng was doing behind the scenes. So there's several parties allege that Cloud Innovation, but not directly, so not Lu Heng directly, but a sister organization of a sister organization was essentially buying people's votes. There are several people who will testify to this, by the way, but essentially the allegation was that the organization that was representing Lu Heng's interest and Cloud Innovation's interest wanted people to sign over their MyAfrinic portal login details so that they could cast the vote. The reason for that, by the way, is because there were allegations that there were previously attempts at vote buying, and people didn't honor the deal. They took the money and then didn't vote according to the line that these guys wanted them to vote along. And so this time around, it's like, no, you have to give us your MyAfrinic login details, we'll cast the vote, and you know, in exchange for money. Now, Lu Heng has denied this vehemently. Lu Heng has said the accusation that he is trying to buy votes is stupid because it's unaffordable. Like, it is too much money. But the evidence to the contrary, I must say, is overwhelming. There are just so many people who have said independently, people who are not active members, who are not on mailing lists, who do not deal with Afrinic every day, who are like, what is this email I got that's offering me money to vote according to a certain line? And so, you know, what exactly has happened there, unfortunately, we don't know yet. But the counter to this, by the way, is that there is a group inside Afrinic that pretty much, they don't buy votes, but they cook the elections, is the allegation. And so there are these two camps that have, there's actually way more than two camps in Afrinic. There's probably like 4, 5, 6 camps. But these warring camps that kind of made it unpalatable for everybody else to be there, were essentially, the one was manipulating Afrinic policy and sometimes just violating policy, allegedly, to ensure that certain candidates were not even on the ballot. And on the other side, you have people who are going, well, we need to win this thing at all costs, and allegedly bought votes. And so the elections get ugly. The Cloud Innovation launches another injunction application against Afrinic because of the fact that none of Cloud Innovation's preferred candidates were even allowed on the ballot. And the court ruled in Cloud Innovation's favor, said Afrinic violated its policies. And so the election couldn't happen. And then board members' tenures started running out. And so one board member can't continue, next board member can't continue, and now the board is incorate. And crucially, before I make everybody seasick, let's just stop the slide there for a second. Crucially, and this has been, by the way, there are plenty of people in the room who tried to warn Afrinic that this was coming. That if you don't get credit today, we don't have time to go through it all, and I don't want to miss anybody out who has also silently contributed. There have been a few vocal people, but there are also people who've worked behind the scenes, warning diligently, Afrinic's policies are not well thought out. They need to be revised. You're going to run into trouble. The hiring of the former CEO, Eddie Kaihura, who, by the way, is a great guy, was similarly mired in controversy because there was an allegation, for example, in the Afrinic bylaws, it says that the CEO cannot be from the same country in which Afrinic is registered, right? Mauritius in this case. So in other words, no Mauritian is allowed to be an Afrinic CEO. That is in direct conflict with Mauritius's own laws on equity, on hiring equity in the country. And so if you wanted to attack, that's another avenue on which you can attack Afrinic. Right? So Afrinic was doing such a bad job of guarding its flanks that it had these gaping holes in its policies that allowed client innovation to just drive straight through them. Essentially do whatever it needed to do to ensure that Afrinic couldn't essentially torpedo its whole business. And so the situation with the elections we've covered. Then the two-punch of the 1-2 punch is that another application comes and says the board cannot make decisions as the board while they are in Core8. Afrinic needs an election, and the board needs to be reconstituted, become Core8, and the organization must continue within the guidelines of its own policies. So there's another failure of Afrinic policy. Why in the hell is there no way to reboot the thing? If your number of directors falls under quorum, if you just go look through basic things like the Sectional Title Act in South Africa, there's always a way to recover. How is there no self-recovery mechanism built in? And once again, Afrinic was warned about this repeatedly. But there was no one with the incentive to ever test the policies. And so people just ran roughshod over these policies, carried on as if nothing was wrong, until the one day you try to take someone's $300 million asset away, and all of a sudden he has all the incentive in the world to rip the holes in your policies to shreds. And so before you want to tackle something like this, so fair game. If Afrinic wants to test in court and through its policies whether cloud innovations allocations were done improperly, that's fair. That's fair to do. But your house needs to be in order before you do that, because otherwise this happens. All right, so that was the final paralyzing blow to Afrinic. And so there's now no board, no CEO. The CEO's contract ran out. And so there's two potential narratives here. The one is that there was an avenue to extend Eddie Kaihura's contract, and they didn't take it. And the other one was that, no, there's after that application to say the board can't do anything, the board can't appoint a new CEO or extend the current CEO's contract. So, there were varying legal opinions on this, and ultimately the legal opinion that said Eddie has to leave and leave Afrinic without a CEO, that legal opinion won out. And off goes Eddie, which was the last backstop. Because there's certain things in Afrinic's bylaws that allows the CEO to do things while the board is being reconstituted. And now there's no one with that executive power. Okay, so current status. So that was not the end of it. Afrinic has subsequently been placed in receivership. That happened on the 12th of September 2023. Receivership is not a bankruptcy proceeding, right? So people might associate that with business rescue or liquidation. This was essentially an administrator that was appointed with the exclusive purpose of reconstituting the board and making sure that there's an election and that the board is reconstituted based on the elections in line with Afrinic's policies as written. But the receiver was to hold the elections within 6 months. That would have been yesterday. And we might have had a very different conversation here today. But a former Afrinic board member and a guy who managed to convince the Mauritian courts that he can act as the chair, we haven't quite figured out how that's happened. His name's Benjamin Eshun. He wrangled a stay. So without boring you with the technicalities, you can watch John Curran's brilliant update on how we got here. But it was, once again, Mauritian court. It was an injunction with a counter-injunction and a counter-counter injunction, status quo, and as far as I know right now, the receiver is stayed permanently until something else happens. So Afrinic is back stuck in limbo, and a former board member at Afrinic orchestrated it for it to be that way. And that raises serious questions about what the game is here. Because despite their differences, right, despite the differences between resource members who are aggrieved with the amount of resources cloud innovation was given, who might not like Lu Heng, whatever the case might be, there was a broad agreement amongst resource members with say, with a huge amount of say in Afrinic. One might even say the majority of the vote, who said that the receiver was a very good thing. A very good thing. And in one fell swoop, that's been undone. Well, I say one fell swoop. It happened over months in the Mauritian courts. Something that the majority agreed was good is now blocked. And so Benjamin Eshun, also during this, he asked the Supreme Court to appoint 3 directors to call an AGMM. So Benjamin's alternative to having the receiver do the election is he wants the court to appoint 3 directors. I don't know on what basis he wanted that done, because Mauritian court documents are sealed. Unlike in South Africa, where they are public, in Mauritius they are sealed unless the people involved open them up, and you can only publicly disclose them under certain circumstances. And the only parties to this was Benjamin and Afrinic. So previously, the court documents could leak out to the press, to the rest of the membership, and so on, because there were lots of people involved. And cloud innovation has lots of allies and likes to brag about what it's done. And so the court documents became public and readily available as a result of that. Now, we have no insight in how the Mauritian courts came to this conclusion, what Benjamin was asking for, but mercifully in this case, the courts actually said that ruled against Benjamin's proposal. So against the proposal to appoint 3 directors, call it an election that way. So, but I know previously Eddie Kaihura, the former CEO, he had attempted something very similar, but he had gone with essentially an independently drawn up list of candidates, senior people that he did not necessarily see eye to eye with, and proposed that to the court as a way to get out of this. So this was now before the receiver application. So because the receiver thing is quite lengthy, you have to now wait for 6 months to call an election. So Eddie was trying to pull Afrinic out of its stall quickly and go, hey, here's a way for us to reconstitute our board and get, jumpstart this engine. And the court struck that down too, didn't like it. Then John Curran explained that Eshun is believed to be seeking leave to appeal in the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council of the UK. Because what happens when you reach a stalemate in Mauritius is you have to appeal to the UK. That's now the next step in this process of that avenue of attack. But don't worry, that's not the only option and not the only way out of this Gordian knot. Curran also warned that Eshun's case could take up to another 2 years to resolve that way. That's the current status. I asked Benjamin for comment. This is what he told me. I'm just going to read it into, I'm walking away from the microphone the whole time. I'm very sorry to the people who are watching online. Dear Jan, I regret to inform you that the matters in question are currently sub judice, and therefore I am unable to engage in any discussion or provide comments at this time. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation in this matter. Regards, Benjamin. So that's that. No detail on why he did what he did, what he's hoping for, and whether indeed he wants to go to the Privy Council. So now for the meat and potatoes. And let me offer some options and some thoughts to hopefully kickstart a discussion about how this might proceed. If I can, will forgive a jab. So dividing internet resources by geography, in my not so humble opinion, is incredibly dumb. But we're stuck with it. So there comes a stage where you have to put aside your idealism, realize the world you're living in, and pragmatically look and go, okay, this is how things are for now. We can strive towards change, but we have to exist in the system now. What do we do? And so John Kieran explained that the NRO, so there's like 3 different organizations that handle various aspects of number resources on the internet. The NRO is one of them. NRO is like is a gathering of the registries, right? Now, the NRO has asked one of its sister organizations, the ASOAC, which is an ICANN organization. So those are the big guns, which is why ICANN's logo is on the screen. So ICANN is being appealed to here to create to flesh out the policy that governs RIRs, regional internet registries like Afrinic. And essentially, it's saying they've asked the AOCAC in particular, and this is now John Kieran saying something without saying something. They've asked the AOCAC to look at a policy to de-recognize RIRs. And so that to me is a shot across the bow. It's if Afrinic continues to fuck about, that's my 1 PG-13 fuck for the day. Then the ultimate consequences could be that you de-recognize Afrinic, you start up a new organization from scratch with policies properly thought out, with everything in place, with essentially a constitution underpinning the organization that, so that policies can't be messed with at will, and you start from scratch. But that is not an easy path either. For anybody who was involved in the .Africa situation, when, like, invariably what's going to happen is there are going to be vested interests that are, would be opposed to ICANN doing that. It will be taken to court, and it'll have to be fought out there over several years. But that's a path forward. And so even though it'll most certainly involve legal action, at the end of the day, Afrinic 1.0 will cease to exist, and Afrinic 2.0 will be put in its place. By the way, ASOAC, that stands for the Address Supporting Organization Address Council. I don't know why they have address twice, but be that as it may, it's one of those acronyms. Now, on the topic of pragmatism, there's also people who are like, listen, just consign Afrinic to the abyss. We don't need another RIR. That's tempting, but not realistic. In a system where other RIRs exist, Africans have to have sovereignty over their number resources. It is essential. We can discuss that. This is me throwing thoughts out there for us to discuss. I'm happy to back it up later. So, in our discussion, I want to just also throw this thing out there, which has really stayed with me since I've heard Mandela speak the words himself. Your duty is to work with human beings as human beings, not because you think they are angels, right? So, like, understand where people are coming from, understand the reality of the situation. So, let's think about corruption. Can it be eliminated? Is it worth expending the resources to eliminate corruption at its root? Or must we accept some level of graft so long as things work? And let me give 2 examples. There's a functional difference versus someone scoring a sweet international trip versus someone scoring a /8, right? So that is something to think about. Sometimes pragmatism is more effective than enforcing a moral code. So instead of trying to catch corruption and weed it out and punish people for example, accepting bribes to fast-track your driver's license, build it into the business model. That's one option. Then the other thing, I was almost in two minds to bring this up, but Afrinic is deeply divided, and so is Afrinic, and there is incredible bigotry. Sorry, this was, excuse the spacing issue, this was built in a different package than it's being displayed with. So this is just a basic overview of Anglophone and Francophone Africa with some of the other languages that make up our beautiful continent as well. And the reason I bring this up, as uncomfortable as it is because from the beginning, there was a deep divide in Afrinic along these lines, Francophone and Anglophone. And even though the cultures in those countries differ significantly and people clash, like what ends up happening is a form of tribalism. And so I am, in the spirit of saying the uncomfortable truths out loud, I'm throwing this out there in the spirit of understanding the deeper problem so that we can build a sustainable solution. So there's, and the reason I was hesitant to even go here is there's electioneering happening around the world, and politicians love stoking our base tribalist instincts for their own gain. Propaganda is more effective when you have an enemy. But while we face the ugly truth, we might as well face the totality of it. And, you know, perhaps as I was thinking about this, I'm like, maybe at this rate, we shouldn't just have one RIR for Africa, if that's the way it's going to go. But also, I'm reminded, those lines are imaginary. The only meaning they have is the ones we give them. So, let's do some questions before we get to the discussion. Should Afrinic even be a members organization? Why not become an IP broker, cut out the middleman? But the ICANN ICP2 revision, that's the governing document for RIRs, might block this. You could, you know, but let's say this is how it works. Then it would lease resources to anyone from anywhere, provided they pay and abide by a code of conduct. Now, the counter argument is we've seen this movie before. Telkom. Monopolies are bad, no duh. And so how will prices be controlled? Who has oversight? What about a hybrid, for-profit on the IPv4 side and non-profit elsewhere? And there, it's dangerous to have an imbalance of incentives, is my counter-argument. Inter-RIR transfers, competition can be good. Other RIRs are doing this. Lots of members are asking for inter-RIR transfers. That's where you move your number resources, your IPs, your AS, your whatever, to RIPE, or ARIN, or APNIC, or wherever you want to go, where you find things are more palatable for you. But in a world of inter-RIR transfers, how do we make sure Afrinic remains an attractive option? Because the thing is, for a lot of the vested interests, they don't care if Afrinic's an attractive option. They just want security for their number resources. But the people who are going to solve this problem have to think through that. Then we have to seriously consider leaving Mauritius, which is another unpopular thing to say, as Afrinic. We have to evaluate alternatives very carefully, though. You have to look at the stability of the country that you're going to put it in. You have to weigh the robustness and the independence of the judiciary. You cannot have a situation where a Garnier order is granted to an offshore company at own risk and perils. That's bad. You can't have a situation where the ultimate deciding, like if things deadlock, you appeal to the UK government. That's a problem. So these are things that need to be thought about when we think about permanent solutions. Then should litigation continue against cloud innovation and resource members like them? Should those resources be reclaimed? And so elsewhere in the world, things are a little, I want to say things seem a little more forgiving in that sense. It's only if your organization collapses that the number resources get reclaimed. Reclaiming number resources from someone who is still doing business, it's quite unprecedented unless there was some kind of fraud involved. And so that's something to think about as well. Then the other thing is we've just heard from Jeff. IPv6 adoption, so how long is IPv4 scarcity going to even remain a thing? So, like, why worry about the IPv4 addresses being gobbled up by IP brokers and trying to, deal with cloud innovation and taking it to court and wasting all that time and resources on that if IPv4 is on a natural progression down and IPv6 on a natural progression up? I'm not saying that's the answer, I'm saying that's a potential answer. And then how do we fix voting? How do we make it that the voting in Afrinic is credible? That we don't have these allegations and counter-allegations of fraud and vote buying and that sort of thing. Is there a system to fix that? All right. I'm going to remind you of the Chatham House rule, and then I'm going to open the floor to questions, discussions, and comments.
We are running quite late. We extended the session a bit, so I think we can't have long discussion sessions. Lunch is already on the go, but I guess that there is an urgent need for some people to have a chat, so let's try and keep them brief.
I'm not going to go
let's
into
keep
lunch.
it on topic.
I'm not going to go into lunch. The part
and
of the
let's
reason
keep it friendly.
Sorry. Part of the reason we chose the slot is so we can go into lunch. I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm not going to go have lunch. I'll be right here. Yeah. So let's do this thing.
Hello, my name is Mark Elkins. Why am I here? I used to be a board member. I was a board member of Afrinic for 6 years. But I've also followed Afrinic since before its inception. I do think when you start with stolen versus cloud innovation, stolen as in employee number 2 stealing stuff, I think you're losing, you're showing perhaps the flavor of the company, the organization, but I don't think that's cognizance of why we're here today, which is how to unfuck it. Why have I got, who is information out of date? I have no idea. Lu Heng's information was out of date, and as far as I understand, when he was told to update it, he told them to F off.
That was there. The official line from them was, they went and checked and there were a handful of records that were, but yes, point taken, but we can debate
so
the relevance.
He refused to update the information. That I agree with. I think at the end of the day, yes, he probably did use it for VPN usage. And then remembering that he's from Hong Kong, and initially Hong Kong wasn't, you could do things there, it was under sort of pseudo-British rule or stuff like that. And I think his biggest fear of admitting anything is that if he does admit that he uses it or used it for VPN purposes, he would probably get locked up and then murdered or something, I don't know, whatever. So obviously he's against his being killed or put into prison. I was chair of non-com at Afrinic for a long time on multiple sessions, unless I was actually trying to vote or something. And I can say that the voting systems that were involved on membership or people being voted onto the board, I believe it was free and fair, apart from influences on people who had the opportunity to vote. I believe the systems that actually ran were correct. I didn't see any errors in it. There would be 3 people, whoever was chair of non-com, the CEO, and the law guy? Ashok. Were the 3 people that would unlock the system.
Yeah.
But I do believe it was fair.
Okay, so let's pause there for a second because there's something I forgot to mention. Which is that there was an incident and the policy still stands today. So previously there were no like major impediments to who can be appointed or who can stand for election. And at some point, those requirements were changed to you had to have attended a certain number of, and that, like, so there's policy changes, sorry, let me finish that thought. Yeah, sorry, full sentences, sorry. There was a policy change implemented where suddenly you had to have attended 3 meetings. I'm sorry, I'm rushing because I'm cognizant of how much time. So all of a sudden, there's minimum requirements on who can stand for the election that weren't there before. And the problem isn't that. Implementing requirements is not a problem. The problem is that they can be implemented on the fly and by the board without the members having any say on that. And so when I'm talking about problems with the elections that need to be fixed and why I believe a constitution is important, it's so that board members can't do that.
Well, then I really am in the shit because I helped put that particular thing in place because we wanted people who are interested in the organization rather than any Tom, Dick, and Harry deciding that he was going to do a power play. Technically, in the bylaws, and I checked it because I got it on my laptop, 13.8, auto reappointment of board members. If there's no person that can actually take up no new person that can take the seat, then technically the previous board member is simply reappointed, and that simply hasn't happened for some wonderful reason. So there's something else going on in that organization. 22.2 states that funds, if Afrinic does fold, the funds, existing funds, after any settlement need to be moved to a similar organization, i.e. Afrinic 2.0, hopefully.
That was very forward-thinking.
We tried. And then the problem with Afrinic is the pricing is high. Always has been. But then I think that's also the case of any organization that gets created, the CEO, etc., will try and extend the scope of that organization as much as possible so he can make as much money as possible. I use the word he, she, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
Those are the points that I came across. I am all in favor of Lu Heng. Please just keep that V4. We don't give a shit because we're going to move to IPv6. We've got to move to IPv6 one day, and the sooner it happens, the better. And I'll sit down now.
Thanks.
Great discussions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to go,
I'll be quick.
to you, Alan, and then to the, but you were first.
Thank you. I actually asked my question out of line. I'm so sorry. You made a couple of statements. First of all, thank you very much for the synopsis. I was a founding director of Afrinic. In those days, everything was going great. We were still doing just technical coordination. It really became a political organization that nobody wanted to be a part of. Vika Mpasani ended up being the representative from South Africa on the board of directors. And from then on, it was kind of questionable. And I still question all these things that you think could possibly be fixed up in a version 2. I'd just like to point out there is another option, and that is that there is no registry for Africa, and that Africans can go to Europe or Asia or America, and you didn't offer that as one other potential option. You just said how difficult it is to actually unfuck the current situation.
So that is an option, and my stance was that I think Africa should have sovereignty over its resources. Now, that is not a universal view, but it is a political football. So yeah, we could go back to the old system where this part of Africa gets its resources from ARAN, and this part of Africa goes to APNIC, and this part of Africa goes to RIPE to get their resources. But that is unpalatable for a number of reasons. And ideally, it shouldn't be regional at all, right? That's why I said I think it's dumb that it's geographic at all. But let's get real about the politics of this situation. It smacks of colonialism, right? Let me just call a spade a spade. And that's why it's unpalatable for people.
Hello, my name is Frank. I'm visiting from Tanzania, and I wanted to ask for a clarification of something that if I got it right, what you said. When the applications for the allocations were made by Cloud Innovation for VMs, as we all believe, you said Afrinic staff knew they were used outside Africa.
Yes.
But the VMs could be in Africa, potentially, as far as I know.
Yeah, absolutely. But the ultimate customer is in China. So
accessing a VM that is in Africa with an African IP.
Potentially an African IP, but it didn't have to be. It could those VPNs could terminate anyway. So he could, and it might be if you're trying to break out of the Great Firewall and you're offering a VPN service, it might be a great idea to have servers all over the world. And so, but yeah, the thing is, based on the very credible testimony that I've heard. The fact is that whoever assigned these resources to Cloud Innovation knew from the beginning the end customer was people in mainland China. It was not Africans. Yeah, so that's the distinction I wanted to make. Thanks.
Hi, Sander Stefan. First want to mention I'm not an Afrinic member. I'm from the Netherlands, so don't want any colonialism. I'm very much against that.
Dude, my surname is Vermeulen. Guess where I'm from?
I know, but happy to help if requested. Will not give unsolicited advice here. But the important thing is I'm currently a member of the ASO/AC that you mentioned.
Cool.
So while I can't speak on behalf of the organization, I'm not the chair. I don't have any power on my own. So for all the official stuff, please go to the website. I do want to say that we are taking the input of Africa very seriously in the whole ICP2 processes we are doing. So the first question we got was to review a document written by the Executive Council, by all the CEOs. For that was a task we had to do, so we did that on our own. But then the follow-up task is to actually come with updates to ICP2. We are working on that. We're first establishing like the principles, what are the things we want, without going into all the details of getting the right wording. And after that, we will go to finally write the text. We will do rounds in all regions, so we will ask the RAR staffs, including Afrinic, to do surveys or what they need to get input from this region. We are also going to attend the RAR meetings, which Africa doesn't have at the moment. So we are looking at options to do things there online, so it's accessible for everybody. And so we are trying to keep the African people involved in this because Africa deserves better than what's currently happening. And we really want to make sure that it's not the rest of the world laying down the rules for Africa here. We really want to include the African people in that. So there will be announcements when the time comes. Please participate.
Thank you. Yes, let me draw an underlined, bold, italic on that. If I have had one impact here today, and that's that more resource members participate in these processes, at the end of the day, that's a win. The other one is if more resource members who are not involved in the fight in Mauritius right now get involved with the people who are trying to get Afrinic back on its feet, to get an election going, to get board members in place. If your organization is not involved in that yet, please chat to the people who are involved in that fight. And the more people can get involved to get that done and figure out what's happening with the stay of the receiver and all that stuff, the better.
Hi, Ian. Paul, I think it is right to disclose that I am Crystal Webb, one of the parties who has an injunction. In general, thank you for giving other people a really good synopsis. One area where there are two areas where I fundamentally disagree with you. One, I think you take far too charitable a view of John Curran. I think there's quite a lot of problems there. But the second thing is that Yes, there are things on which we should critique the Mauritian legal system. There are some really daft things with Mauritian courts, one of which is the way its sub judice jurisprudence is developed. It does pose problems, and I say that from the perspective that I can't tell you about certain things that are in court papers because AfriNIC refuses consent for the matter to be discussed. So, take it from there. On the whole, though, the Mauritian legal system is manifestly well developed. And, if you look at the guys running .Africa and so on, I don't know, with ZARC rebranding, I'm not sure what they're called when they're in Mauritius, but they put their fundamental operations in Mauritius. People choose to be in Mauritius as opposed to other jurisdictions for very good reasons, which include the functioning of their courts. In this particular litigation, yes, some of the weaknesses in Mauritian jurisprudence really come to the center, and some of the problems within the way their courts operate come to the fore. But as a litigant in the matter, I can assure you that 99% of the reason why the litigation is dragging as much is because of the malevolence of people at AfriNIC trying to drag the litigation across. And without going into the particulars of an application because of sub judice, what I can state without any fear, because we've got the dismissals of, is that one of the reasons why anybody who goes to court now and asks the court to appoint directors, which is provided for in the Companies Act, that application has to be dismissed by the court. And the reason it has to be dismissed is because AfriNIC has opposed the first application to appoint directors so that the board is never incorate. And it has no rational reason for doing so, other than that it was quite happy to drag into litigation. And that leads me to so thank you for the note. But I think one of the most powerful ways of ensuring that AfriNIC does actually get from its fucked state into a less fucked state, because this isn't, you can't fix this sort of thing overnight. But one of two things has to happen. Either the legal representatives of AfriNIC, or more importantly, the internal legal officer, needs to actually go to the court and say, listen, court, I have no faculty to operate on behalf of the company. As an officer of the court, I have to tell you this company is headless. Please appoint a curator ad litem. Please do something. You express disbelief about how did Benjamin Eshon convince the courts that he's the chairman of the board when the court has already ruled. Well, no, because the papers come with an AfriNIC seal that is provided by the AfriNIC legal director. So as long as Christian Dondi is prepared to go along with Benjamin Eshon, this matter is going to be litigated, because how does the court deal with it? So quite honestly, and I've expressed as much to him, but as far as I'm concerned, he has an ethical obligation as an officer of the court to inform the court of the frailty of the situation and ask the court to appoint a Mauritian barrister as a curator ad litem. It's not usual in corporate matters, but there is precedent for it. And again, I probably have to disclose I've consulted on this quite extensively. Or they could just withdraw their resistance to the appointment of directors pursuant to the original application. Now, of course, that's really good for my company. So I am, saying, stop opposing my fucking application, and you'll get a board elected. Probably not the board that my company or associates want to elect it, but that's irrelevant. So I don't think it's fair to at this juncture say that lawfare, because again, if you look at the list, there's a good 30-40 cases that AfriNIC has experienced with Net Dynamics, whatever the guys and Elad Cohen and all that. AfriNIC has won a lot of cases against parties which legitimately ought to have taken across. But there is this insufferable arrogance that comes from the way AfriNIC chooses to litigate. And whatever you may think of me or my company or Lu Heng or any of his companies or anybody else, we have to decide whether or not we believe in the rule of law. And if we believe in the rule of law, then we have to accept that there's going to be shenanigans. But legal shenanigans are easily overridden by AfriNIC not being part of the problem.
Yeah. So Paul, your point is well made. Thank you for that. So I'll respond to that in a second. But before you launch into a TED talk, I wanna give another opportunity.
No.
But I appreciate that. I think you've made your point well, and we'll come back to that in a sec.
Thank you. I promise this won't be another lightning talk at the microphone. My name is Nishal. For some of you that know me, I used to be the CTO at AfriNIC. I'm not speaking as an AfriNIC ex-staff member, but I'm speaking as somebody who used to be an operator of an internet service provider in the 90s. I know most of you in this room. I know how old you are, where your children are, where you've buried the bodies as well. So let me ask you, because I already know the answer to this, how many of you had more than a /19 in 1996? Yeah, I didn't think so, right? I mean, you know, aside from like maybe 3 people that are sitting in this room, one of the founding reasons that we have an RIR for Africa is because there was recognition that policies that were used in other parts of the world were not necessarily applicable to networks in Africa. If you wanted an allocation out of Aaron in those days, and Aaron used to be the RIR responsible for us, you'd need to be able to justify a /19, which was a crap ton of space, and even with a much stronger rand, a crap ton of money to network operators that were starting up then. One of the first things that Afrinic did, and this is not Afrinic doing anything, this is the Afrinic community, and that's you, by the way. One of the first things that happened out of the Afrinic community was that the minimum allocation for LIRs, ISPs, like yourselves, dropped to a /22. And if you look at the allocation schema and how it was distributed to network operators in Africa, that improved dramatically after the start of Afrinic. I'm not here to tell you what you should think of Paul and Jan and whomever else is going to be coming to the microphone. You can have your corridor conversations. But I want to remind you that policies that apply to one part of the world are not necessarily applicable to other parts of the world. So when you come to the microphone and make quite silly statements like we don't need or blanket will fit, that's simply not true. One size does not fit all. Otherwise, I would be crammed into a size 28 pair of trousers that would fit me wonderfully, and so would most of you as well. So not one size for everybody. 2, thank you for acknowledging Afrinic staff for actually being quite brave in this. I think that people here think it's Afrinic staff that are fighting against them. That's not the case. For those of you that don't know, the guy running around with the camera, I can't see him. Where is he? Ah, there he is. Avi is Afrinic staff. He's unknown to us from Afrinic because he's good at AV and everything else that he does. So thank you, Afrinic, and thank you, Avi, for being here this week. And the third thing that I was asked to remind people about was that if you're a legacy resource holder, or a normal resource holder, obviously, you can still update your information in the Afrinic WHOIS database free of charge. There's this misconception that if you're a legacy resource holder, i.e. you got resources before the RIR system went into place, you can't go to Afrinic and update your information or any of the other RIRs. You absolutely can. And at least at Afrinic, they don't charge you for doing any of this stuff. So please, if you are a resource holder, a legacy resource holder in particular, you can update your information free of charge. Opinions? Lunchtime. Thank you.
Thanks, Nishal.
Hi, Graham from the internet. Just one small-ish question. The networks that have potentially the most to lose, I mean, in Africa, that's mostly the MNOs, but any of the big network operators, I know that 1 or 2 of them have kind of stepped up and got involved, but my sense is the vast majority of the really big guys are actually just not even caring. And in business leadership, I'm not seeing much interest in this issue. It's kind of like, well, go to legal and ask them if they can write a nasty letter, and that's kind of where it ends. And is that the same as what you're seeing? Are the big guys just completely ignoring it and hoping it'll go away on its own, or what?
Yeah, so I have to plead ignorance there because the companies that are involved are very private about their involvement. And so, but the sense I'm getting is that it's the vast minority of resource members. And it's, look, honestly, South African resource members make up a huge chunk of Afrinic. But it's the vast minority with people who care enough to have kind of stick their necks out and go, let's do something about this. Let's launch, let's, orchestrate the official receiver application. So I'm going to agree with you, but with an asterisk on that to say that I don't know what I don't know, because these guys don't want to talk about it if they litigate like that, unfortunately.
And I think I've got a comment on that. I mean, let's face it. If you are prepared to stick your neck out on this, if you're a heavy resource, if you're a firm with, /16, if you're a large ISP, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your company not to needlessly stick your neck out. So the only two groups of people that can really risk sticking their neck out on this, is either if you've got so much resources that your business, that it becomes an absolute business essential, or if you're a small company with a small block and you're prepared to be brave and stupid at the same time. I mean, that's the reality.
I tend to disagree with you because the fact is that the MTN, Vodacom, even Cell C, Telcom, they all need IPs.
Yeah, but my point is that it's in their interests to do things privately. It's not in their interest.
Privately, agreed.
What I'm saying is, this is the conundrum that exists, which is that in order to do anything, especially to do anything publicly, you are taking a risk. You shouldn't be needing to take a risk, but the reality is that you are. So you either need to be very big and very prepared to bring out all of the guns that you've got, and then be accused of lawfare, or you've got to be small, brave, and stupid. And I won't say where I see myself in this, but I'm certainly not very big.
With that, is there anybody from CETA here or at the conference while I have the microphone? If somebody from CETA is hearing this, please speak to whoever you need to speak to so you can reclaim the info plan block and vote. Please.
Okay. Guys, I'm needing to get the venue cleared out so we can set it for the next venue. So after these last two questions, we have to close it. Continue the discussions over lunch, please.
Thank you.
Otherwise, the hotel managers are going to come try and attack me soon. So after this, no lightning talks, quick questions to the point, please.
Thank you.
Quick clarification on what you said just a while ago. People in the room should realize of Afrinic, 1/3 of all resources, IP addresses, are held by people in South Africa. 1/3 of all the revenue that Afrinic collects comes from South Africa. 1/3 of all the membership in Afrinic comes from South Africa. South Africa has a big part in this, and we should be able to, just as one country, do something about this problem.
Thank you.
So I'm Andrew from the internet. Africa has a problem that foreigners come in and take the resources and they run off, and they use it outside of South Africa and outside of Africa, and the foreigners, every other country, Europe, the United States, Australia, is happy to use those resources to the detriment of Africa. That's what's happening here.
Thank you for that comment. I don't quite follow, but appreciate your view nonetheless. Okay, folks, I'm going to close the session because we have been officially booted out. Thank you for your time, and I'll catch you over lunch and over beer.
Sorry, one item I was asked to remind people of. The social this evening, there's buses going after the last session. There's going to be 3 buses, one every 15 minutes. So once the session is finished,